In some of the other materials in this module, we've looked at the experiences and history of transgender people across different cultures. Now let's take a look at the deep history of gender identities within the archaeological record, which is going to involve the process of ungendering the past. To begin, what do we mean when we talk about gender archaeology? Well, it's a method of studying the past societies through their material culture by closely examining the social construction of gender identities and their relations to each other. This involves the roles, positions, and characteristics of all genders, as well as children, within societies. It became an established methodology beginning in the 1970s as sort of a branch of general feminist anthropology. Prior to this methodology, though, it was argued that gender and children were invisible in the archaeological record, and that it was impossible to conclude anything about gendered lifeways from material remains. So, are women, third gender people, and children really invisible in the archaeological record? Let's take a look. For the general history of gender studies, we can look at least within archaeology specifically, we can look at the example of Woman the Gatherer of the Book. At this time, archaeology was male-dominated and discouraged gender research. But second wave feminism really inspired this sort of rejection of the prior assumptions that had been established within the discipline of anthropology. So this book was published in 1983 as a reaction to another book called Man the Hunter. You can assume why. And this book emphasizes the role of women in shaping the human past. So in terms of the calorie provision that they provide, if you remember back to early in the semester, the gathered resources within hunter-gatherer communities actually provide a majority of the calories within these communities, and men who provide more of the meat sources really only provide smaller calorie amounts. Also different divisions of labor, and topics having to deal with adaptation and evolution. Many of the authors who contributed to this book lived through second wave feminism, so we can understand where they got their inspiration from. There was a real focus on the difference between sex and gender, and especially the importance of intersectionality. At its core, though, this book and this general wave itself was a push to erase this sort of false notion of biological or natural roles for men and women within society. Gender archaeology, then, is focused on deconstructing research, or at least this was the major emphasis in the 80s and early 90s. We were trying to, deconstruct this male-centered or androcentric bias within the research that was being done. Male ethnographers, either didn't consider the roles of women or their perspectives, or they just failed to realize that they lacked the ability to access those sources of information. Coming in as a man, you're not going to be able to speak maybe in a secure setting with women to learn more about their lives. That book, Male the Hunter, was really more of an emphasis on contemporary gender stereotypes that were being projected back into the past. One article in particular around that same time was written by Margaret Conkey and Janet Spector. And the quote you can see here talks about how they attempted to show how archaeology is substantiating or perpetuating this particular sort of gender mythology that just doesn't stand out nowadays. We know that there aren't these traditional roles of males and females that the way that they have been practiced in the past. So how do we see different people archaeologically? Well, there's three sort of main lines of evidence we can try and look at. Anthropomorphic representations of human bodies themselves, so helped us to kind of understand how people view their own bodies or just the human body more generally. This is what we find when we look at this sort of evidence, though, is that the distinct sexes that we're used to in the sort of gender binary nowadays, what's often lacking or shows these representations show a mixture of characteristics rather than being clearly male or clearly female. The discipline of bioarchaeology allows for the identification of biological sex first and foremost, which is different from gender identity and expression. It can also, however, help us learn about differences in health, labor, or diet that impacted the sexes differentially. And then lastly, the treatment of human remains themselves, how they're buried and what they're buried with. These are the types of funerary rituals that people engaged in. Now, it's important to recognize that funerary rituals are for the living more than the dead. And so they're the ones who choose what object someone is buried with, ultimately. What do we learn from children's toys when we're looking for gendered children in the archaeological record? Well, we learn about the socialization of children, the cultural norms within different societies, and the gender norms that are, being enculturated or imposed upon them. We can possibly, try to associate children's toys with specific genders. A few examples, there are some tombs from the Hellenistic period in Turkey where we see patterns of, female figurines being placed in girls' tombs and male figurines in boys' tombs. There are toys called plagona in Greece. Those are actually small dolls or dollhouse items that have been interpreted, at least, as a way to educate girls on the roles of women in ancient Greek society. Now, what if, when we look at another example in the Czech Republic, this corded ware culture, we see some interesting examples in terms of burial treatment. So on the bottom two boxes here, you see, men are usually buried on their right side with their head pointing west. They have weapons, hammers, knives, other food and drink for the afterlife. Women are usually buried on their left side with their head facing east. They have necklaces, earrings, domestic jugs, and usually some sort of egg-shaped pot near their feet. Well, how do we explain then these other examples? We see, a male skeleton buried on his left side, facing eastward with domestic jugs, or a female skeleton buried with weapons, hammers, and flint knives. If we only look at this from the strict gender binary we recognize today, or that has been recognized, we see these as complete anomalies when maybe they actually weren't within that particular society. Another example are a set of Iron Age burials from the site of Hasanlu in Iran. Cluster analysis, which is actually just looking at similarities in the proportions or concentrations of different types of artifacts within the burials, helped them to recognize 3 different sets of offerings that they interpreted as, dominantly male, female, and then a third one being a third gender. The first cluster, these were biologically female skeletons buried with needles, garment pins, jewelry. Cluster 2 included biologically male skeletons. They were buried with metal vessels, weapons, and armor. But then cluster 3, which made up about 20% of the burials, showed a combination of male and female artifacts, and these were associated with skeletons of both sexes. So definitely potential for some sort of third gender category in this society. Additional evidence supporting the possibility at this site was the Golden Bowl artifact, which was excavated in 1958. It's difficult to really make much out in the colored photograph up above, but when we look at the sketch of the imagery that is in place on the bowl itself, what we see in that red box is what has been interpreted as a bearded man wearing female clothing. This individual is sitting on the floor in a position that, according to patterns in local iconography, was usually reserved for women. So this has more recently been interpreted as a possible representation of a non-binary person. So how does the present get the past wrong? Well, headlines that from when the news broke about this, third gender individuals in the corded ware culture cemetery, we see things like first homosexual caveman found. Researchers dig up homosexual or transsexual caveman near Prague. Gay caveman story overblown. Archaeologists find third gender skeleton in the Czech Republic. Media calls him a caveman erroneously. Yes, exactly. First of all, who said anything about the sexuality of this person? We can only really speak to the biological sex and then try to interpret gender from there. Also, caveman, I don't really know where they got that from. So the present gets the past wrong because of our bias and modern cultural norms that are being imposed on the past. It's really difficult to know how people think of themselves sometimes today. Well, imagine trying to do it for people in the past who we can't speak to, we can't talk to directly. Sexing skeletons can actually be unreliable. depending on how much of the body is preserved, what parts of the body are preserved. There's only certain skeletal markers that would help us to sex these individuals. As I mentioned previously, the funerary ritual itself is undertaken by the living. So if you are a transgender or non-binary person today and your family or culture doesn't accept that, then will your funeral and burial rites accurately reflect your identity? That's not necessarily going to be the case in that sort of situation. So we might actually be missing even more examples of transgender, third gender people in the past. And then lastly, there's the consideration that differential preservation of materials influences the patterns that are actually visible in the archaeological record. So among Stone Age societies in particular, we see, on the basis of artifacts alone, that they were emphasizing the importance of stone technologies, which were traditionally seen as a male activity or associated with males. And this is done at the expense of perishable technologies, which women tended to be more engaged in. So this brings us to the work of Dr. Mary Weissmantel. They're a professor of anthropology at Northwestern University, as well as a curator at the Field Museum of Natural History. Their research interests involve queer feminism, gender sexuality, racism, and inequality, and their work is primarily in India and South America. And I'm including a copy of the chapter that Dr. Weissmantel wrote for the Transgender Studies Reader as part of the additional materials for this week. But I'm going to give you a brief overview of their main points here. So there are many forms of violence that have been inflicted on transgender bodies, both in the past and today. When it comes to archaeology in particular, the focus then is on this sort of systematic erasure of lives and histories that are seen as inconveniently queer. There's actually an incredibly rich amount of evidence of diverse forms of gender identity and expression from sites around the world. For example, carved images and rock art from Australia to Colorado provide little evidence of two sexes due to what's interpreted as more ambiguous genitalia. And for this reason, we really need to abandon this sort of history of manly men and womanly women, which, who were compelled to procreate, because we know that's not always the case nowadays, so it definitely wasn't in the past as well. Instead, we need to recognize that modern researchers' vision of human possibility is limited by cultural biases and their personal experiences. So this means that we really need to turn to the perspective of people from outside the mainstream in order to arrive at hypotheses that a normative person might not even come up with on their own. So one example that Dr. Weissmantel talks about is the Princess of Versailles. This is an Iron Age tomb in France that contains a female skeleton surrounded by bronze and gold artifacts, which typically were only buried with male bodies at this time. This includes the Vix crater, which is the image you see in the upper left corner. This is a gigantic bronze vessel that was imported from Greece. It's almost 5 feet tall and 4 feet across, and it was actually left in the burial full of mead, which is an alcoholic beverage if you're not familiar. The burial itself was discovered in 1952, but not accurately sexed until a restudy that was done in 1991. So this particular case begs the question then, was this person a woman who attained lordly political status and therefore was buried with the same rights that other male leaders were at this time? Or could this have been an intersex individual who attained the status of a religious leader or shaman because of the presentation of their body not matching this sort of male or female standards? Another example then is the site of Cattlehuyuk, which is a Neolithic period site in Turkey. Looking at those sort of 3 primary forms of data that we can look at in the archaeological record, we see, amongst the anthropomorphic figurines, that the analysis of those actually revealed an absence of gender. So the archaeologists, didn't go in and try and make piles of males and female figurines to begin with. They just recorded attributes of the figurines themselves and were able to see this sort of deliberate effort to blur boundaries between different genders or different sexes within these representations. Bioarchaeologists, like I mentioned before, they study the actual signatures of different activities on the body, on the skeleton of people in the past. Well, when we looked at the bodies from Cattlehuyuk, we find that the skeletal data doesn't actually reveal a binary pattern. Instead, everyone had similar morbidity patterns, they performed equally demanding work, and ate the same sort of varied diet. And lastly, the treatment of corpses showed little evidence of socially assigned gender as well. All the individuals were buried in shallow graves with very few grave goods. The bodies were often placed in the same tomb over time, and this sort of just resulted in this haphazard mixing without regard to gender necessarily. So what does all this evidence suggest? Well, it's been interpreted as an absence of gender was a structural feature of this society. Now, this is important to recognize because one of the striking things about Cattlehuyuk is that gender wasn't actually linked to inequality. Instead, gender, for most of human history, people lived in these small egalitarian groups where gender may well have been insignificant, as it apparently was at Cattlehuyuk. But as societies became larger, they became more unequal, and gender started to matter more. What we then see are large, unequal societies that typically denigrate women and punish gender deviance. Once gender inequality has been established as sort of fundamental or natural within a society, it provides a basis for other structures of inequality, such as race and class. So, according to Dr. Weissmantel, we need to ungender our past. And what that means is ungendering our interpretations doesn't mean claiming that gender didn't exist in the ancient past. Ungendering means conceptually uncoupling. That means pulling apart biology and culture, sort of delinking these aspects of gender and society that seem so inseparable today, because it just didn't necessarily mean the same things in the past. So this means we need to ungender our preconceptions. As an example, ritualized cross-dressing was mandated for political and religious leaders in many ancient societies. So this important form of transgender performance today most likely had different meanings within societies in the past. Now, the last example that I'll talk about, and one of your readings from the Sapiens online magazine, is the Lady of Cow from Peru. Now, this is a young woman in her early 20s who was buried in an elaborate tomb within a temple overlooking the sea, surrounded by finery, and the conditions, actually, of this area preserved her body so well that her hair was still there, with her tattoos on her skin are still visible today. Now, when we juxtapose this burial in particular against what some other burials at this time referred to as the Lords of Sipan, which are males buried with war weapons and insignia of power, and also the priestesses, which were females who were buried with other ritual objects, this weapon-bearing lady is an anomaly within this gendered pattern. Now, she's buried grasping these two giant gold-headed war clubs. What this means then is that for the elites who ruled this area, it maybe wasn't especially transgressive for a biological female to carry weapons or a male to take on a feminine role within a ritual, as long as they respected other traditions that marked their membership in a particular lineage. Their own people, the ones who placed them in these tombs with these particular artifacts, may have cared about a different kind of symbolism that marked forms of identity that trumped biological sex in the end. Now, the last point I'll make is that gender variance, even in the past, without fear of stigmatism or punishment, was possibly a freedom allotted only to a privileged few. So those who were members of the elite were able to more freely indulge in sexual and gender experimentation that may have been forbidden to others. But obviously we need a lot more research on this topic before we can definitively conclude anything like that. So I hope you enjoy reading a bit more about the archaeological examples of transgender people in the past.